Alrighty, looks like we are live. So, we are going to be reviewing a debate. Well, it was really a debate. I mean, I guess technically, since it was a disagreement of ideas, you could consider it a debate. It was just an informal debate. I should probably bring this down. An informal debate, I guess you could call this, between William Lane Craig and Scott Clifton. Discussion, debate. Either way, it was informal. I'd consider it a debate because, it was an exchange of ideas where two people disagreed. And we are going to give this a review. This was a really, really good discussion, by the way. I don't know how many people have actually watched this, but this was a very, very good discussion. I think both of them performed well. I do think that Dr. Craig was either misrepresenting or misunderstanding Scott at certain points in the debate, but we'll get to that as we get into this review here. So let me go make sure everything's good. I'm going to go full screen with this. And hopefully everybody can hear it. So I'm going to let it play for a little bit, and then I'm going to check the studio again. If there's any audio issues, please let me know.
Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm hosting a dialogue between none other than Dr. William Lane Craig, and I've got actually a friend of mine, Scott Clifton, here with us, and we're talking about today the Kalam cosmological argument.
All right. So, I let that play. I was doing it in full screen, so I had to pause it to exit the full screen on YouTube to come back. Everybody says it sounds good. All right, I'll let it play through the intros. Obviously, there isn't really a need to comment on those, so I'll just let it play through their intros.
And so I actually don't want to waste any time on this. I want to get directly into the dialogue because we don't have longer than an hour today. Also, let me mention this before we get started, is that we probably aren't going to have time for questions. As much as I would love to do some Q&A with these two, we don't have time to do that. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and just jump straight in. Dr. Craig, give us what we're going to do today is we're going to have a dialogue about, it's sort of an open-ended, friendly conversation about the Kalam cosmological argument. So what I thought was best is if we start with just a short summary presentation from Dr. Craig of what this argument is, and then at that point, we'll jump into dialogue. Scott will he's got some objections to the argument, and we'll run through some of those and just have a great dialogue. So, Dr. Craig, why don't you start us off and give us that summary of the Kalam?
Certainly. Thank you, Cameron. The Kalam cosmological argument is a very ancient form of the cosmological argument that goes back to the efforts of early Christian commentators to refute Aristotle's doctrine of the eternity of matter. And they developed various arguments for the finitude of the past. These arguments were then taken up into medieval Muslim theology when Islam swept across North Africa and evolved into a highly developed argument for the finitude of the past. The name of this theological movement in Islamic theology is Kalam. And so I dubbed the argument that was so characteristic of this movement the Kalam cosmological argument. It was then bequeathed back to the West through the intermediary of Jewish theologians and became a subject of hot debate, finally being ensconced in Immanuel Kant's first antinomy concerning space and time in his monumental critique of pure reason. The argument, as stated by one of its greatest medieval proponents, Al-Ghazali, is very simple. It basically has three steps. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Or alternatively, an even more modest version of premise one would be to say that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Premise two is that the universe began to exist. This is the crucial premise of the argument. Medieval thinkers offered various arguments against the possibility of an infinite temporal regress of events. And in my own work, I've attempted to defend two such arguments against the eternality of the past. In the past century, however, we have found dramatic empirical or scientific evidence for the finitude of the past, both in contemporary cosmogony as well as in the study of the thermodynamic properties of the universe. Both of these fields of study provide dramatic scientific confirmation of the conclusion reached by purely philosophical argument alone, that the universe began to exist. So in my work, there are these four independent arguments in support of the second premise, the universe began to exist. From those two premises, it follows that therefore the universe has a cause. And one can then do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. And a number of very theologically striking properties come out of such an analysis. The argument leads, I think, to the existence of a first, uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is, I think, a core conception of what we mean by God.
Well, thank you for that summary, Dr. Craig. So let's turn into just some open dialogue about this argument. What are the merits of it, and maybe what are some good objections to this argument? So, Scott, take us away. Let's just get into some good dialogue.
So cool. Well, just off the bat, I want to say a couple of things. One is that clearly, if there were ever proof of God's existence, it's the fact that I'm sitting here right now. I want to express my gratitude to both Cameron for arranging this dialogue and to Dr. Craig for his generosity with his time and the clear leap of faith. Cards on the table. I'm a soap actor and I have no philosophical training. So it's a leap of faith on Dr. Craig's part that this is not going to be a waste. I recognize what a rare privilege this is. I recognize that I am in the presence of a great mind who has gone toe to toe with other great minds and won often. So my highest aspiration here is not to win a debate. That would be pretty foolish of me. But to create a document together that sort of maps out the assumptions and intuitions that can cause reasonable people to disagree about whether the universe is something that has a cause. And this dialogue may include me hearing for the very first time answers to my objections that are totally satisfying. I don't know what the response is to some of what I'm going to say here today, and to me that's very exciting. Okay, so that's all. I just wanted to get that out of the way and say that. Dr. Craig, if it's okay with you, I would like to. I'm genuinely agnostic on the truth of the second premise, whether the universe began to exist, and so I would like to grant, for the sake of argument, that the second premise is in fact true, that the universe did begin to exist, because I think that will corral us over to the first premise.
I did want to say really quickly that that's something that I really admire, because it's something that I think I'm seeing more and more. If I go back to when I was a theist and when I was myself a William Lane Craig parrot, if there ever was one, it wasn't common for a lot of those who would object to the Kalam cosmological argument, at least back then. I mean, I debated it all the time, everywhere. It wasn't common for atheists to just grant the second premise and then attack the first. It was usually about granting the first and then just attacking the second, and you'd get all sorts of arguments and everything like that. But I'm glad that it seems that there's starting to be a turnaround, that there's a lot more people that are starting to say, look, I'm willing to grant the first premise. Or rather the second premise. It's the first premise that I take issue with, because I definitely believe there are at least two issues, the two places where I would take issue with the first premise of the Kalam. But we'll get there as we continue along.
Which I think is one more interesting to me. I think you can just do so much with it, and I think it's under scrutinized. So that's I would like to do that. And as I understand it, you have three defenses for your first premise. One is a sort of inductive argument, right? I mean, you look around the world, things have causes. There appears to be no exception to this rule. By the way, Dr. Craig, if at any point I'm misrepresenting you or I've got you wrong, I prefer that you actually interrupt me, because I don't want to talk past you a second longer than I have to. The second argument, as I understand it, is like in it, you could call it like a chaos argument, right? It's in the reductio family, and it's sort of like, well, okay, if that first premise is false, then it becomes inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't just pop into being uncaused out of nothing, right? And then the third argument, as I understand it, is a sort of appeal to our intuitions. We have this deeply held metaphysical intuition that out of nothing, nothing comes. And I was hoping that I could tackle the inductive argument first, because I think that I think that induction doesn't get you there all the way to whatever begins to exist as a cause. And I think I can show that by offering an alternative causal principle that I just made up, but which I believe enjoys exactly as much empirical support. And I'll call it the double causal principle, right? So here's my principle. Whatever has an efficient cause of its existence has a material cause. And I think you can take that and you can sort of make it into a parody Kalam argument, right? So that's the first premise. You can have a second premise that's something like, the universe has no material cause, conclusion, therefore the universe has no efficient cause of its existence. And if I can succeed in showing that there's symmetry here, right? Because this is...
I did want to say that the only difference that I recognize in these two arguments, there's definitely a parity between them, obviously. And I actually think that Scott is very much onto something with that argument that he gave. But the Kalam cosmological argument would be modus ponens. I hope I'm not getting these backwards. Danny, correct me if I am, because I know you're in the chat. The Kalam cosmological argument would be modus ponens, but the argument that Scott just presented would be modus tollens, where it's if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So that's the only difference. But that doesn't mean that the parity that Scott is trying to draw there is in any way invalid, because there's very much that analogy between the two arguments, and it's very much valid.
I believe that this principle enjoys as much empirical support, but that you would reject it, right? You have reasons for rejecting this. And I think that would show that we need a tiebreaker, right? And then we could, if I'm successful in that, we could move on to some of your other arguments, which are also really interesting.
All right. Let me ask you a question, Scott.
Sure.
To begin, do you think that the causal premise of the argument is false, or simply that it's unproven?
And see, me personally, I would say it's false, that the causal premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is false. That the idea that if something begins to exist, that it has a cause, doesn't necessarily need to be true. But that would also bring up the question, and I'm sure that we'll be getting into this a little bit later, is what is meant by begins to exist. That to me, that phrase right there, those three words in the first premise of the Kalam, begins to exist, that I think is really where most of the meat of this argument, most of its validity, really rests on. And that's definitely going to be a point of contention later in this review.
I think that it's false.
Good.
Really?
Good.
Yeah, I think that it's false because, well, so when I think about causality, you know, when I kind of do an armchair analysis of what causality is, it appears to have all these features, right? It appears to be a temporal and spatial process. It appears to take place by an interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause within time and space. I think something begins to exist only if there was a point in time before it existed, where it didn't exist yet, right? There's all these features of causality as we observe it in the empirical world that I think can't be exported to something like the universe, which is defined as the totality of material reality.
Okay, well now wait though. That would not necessarily mean that the causal premise is false.
So what Scott was saying here is essentially that causality seems to be more just a feature that, and yes, Danny, that is true. Causality doesn't seem, it seems to be this thing that is a part of the universe, but that you can't take it and apply it to the universe. Similarly, you could talk about temperature and things like that, like what is the temperature of a cup? What is the temperature of a star? What is the temperature of a planet? But what would it mean to ask what is the temperature of the universe? Likewise, you might ask, well, what is the size of a star? What sort of volume does it occupy, or a planet, or really any object? But it would make no sense to ask what volume the universe occupies, or how big is the universe, even though that is a question people ask. If you really get down into it, it almost really doesn't seem to make much sense. So Scott is sort of saying it's the same thing with causality. We could talk about causality about things within the universe, but to talk about causality as it applies to the universe doesn't seem to make sense. And that William Lane Craig is saying that, well, that doesn't mean that the causal premise is false. And I would agree, that doesn't mean that the causal premise is false. It could just mean that it only applies within the universe. But we'll see what William Lane Craig continues with here.
I mean, that's not a proof of its falsehood. You don't think, do you, that things can just pop into existence uncaused?
No, certainly not. So I don't think that within.
So I actually do want to pause it again here, because this was something that I noticed numerous times throughout the debate, and I'm probably going to mention something every time I notice it, just to sort of bring to light how often Dr. Craig does this to Scott. So Scott is I think did a good thing there, saying, no, I don't believe that. I would have asked Dr. Craig what he means when he says pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. I struggle to even comprehend what that's supposed to mean. The other thing is, and I don't know how many people may have noticed it before I'm mentioning it, and you'll notice it as Dr. Craig continues to do it, he's sort of slipping in the presupposition of an A theory of time, the presupposition of a tense time when he asks that question.
The space-time.
So just keep that in mind.
Universe. I think that, so here, I guess what I would say here is that I think that the scope of the causal principle is physical and not metaphysical, right? Yeah, exactly. I don't think, I think once you get to something like the totality of time and space itself, the causal principle breaks down, and I don't think we have good enough reasons for thinking it would apply to the universe itself.
Right. Okay. Now that's quite different. That's not an attack so much on the idea that something that begins to exist as a cause is the scope of the principle, that you don't want to allow it to apply to the universe itself. Now, there, I think one would want to hear what good reasons would disqualify the universe from lying within the scope of this principle.
There are actually answers to that question. My answer would be, to that question, what sorts of features would disqualify the universe from falling under the scope of this causal principle? I mean, the universe, and I'm sure Dr. Craig would say, I mean, the universe itself is a physical thing, don't you think? And I mean, personally, I would answer yes. But what I would say here, and this would be one major objection that I would just have with the causal principle in general, which is a principle that I think does exist within a particular scale of reality, but doesn't outside of that in either or maybe even one direction. But what I would say here is that the very, very earliest moments of the universe, we know, are described quantum mechanically. And we know through a variety of different experiments and through numerous mathematical equations and numerous observations that causality, in the sense that it's being spoken about here by Dr. Craig, doesn't really apply. And I will go into that a little bit more deeply as this continues on. I just wanted to mention that quickly now.
What is it about the universe that would allow it to come into being uncaused from nothing But
See what he's doing there with the language? I just want you guys to pay attention to that.
the things within space and time couldn't do that. I can't think of any germane feature of the universe that would make it plausible that the entire universe could just come into being uncaused. Now, you did mention one. You said anything that, well, that's not even right. I was going to say, you said anything that begins to exist, there has to be a time before it.
Yeah,
at which it
it's
did
not that
not
I'm,
exist. But that's an attack on the second premise, not the first one. And I think that that principle is false anyway. It would preclude that time had a beginning. If you say that for something to begin to exist, there has to be a time before it during which it did not exist, that would mean that time could never begin to exist, because it would be a self-contradiction to say there was a time before time at which time did not exist. And yet this is commonplace in contemporary cosmology to talk about the beginning of time and space. So I think all you have.
But the question that I want to plant in your guys' head, when cosmologists talk about the beginning of time, do you think they mean the same thing as when Dr. Craig talks about the beginning of time?
To do is to say that something begins to exist at a time t if there is no time earlier than t at which that thing exists. And that would allow time to begin to exist without being self-contradictory. And it would also say that things do begin to exist without there being this sort of empty time before they come into being. So I don't think that principle applied to the universe would be disqualifying for the universe to lie within the scope of the causal premise.
Right. So I should clarify some things here. So it's not that that's my argument, right? My argument here, or my objection here, is not that the universe didn't begin to exist because there was no time, prior to the universe's existence. What I was trying to do there was show that there are all these features of something being caused to exist within our empirical experience of the world that you actually have to sacrifice. You have to jettison those features when it comes to the universe. So, for example, when we see things beginning to exist, or when we see things caused to exist, we see that it's by the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause. We see that it takes place within time and space. There is also this, what to me intuitively seems essential to causality, is the affect-effect relationship, right? So you have a cause which affects something, and from the interaction
Yes.
of the first two, you have the effect, right? And so that you have to get rid of, when it comes to something like creatio ex nihilo. So I'm saying that there are all these.
I actually like that objection there, or really that I don't know if I would really say symmetry here, but I'm going to use that word a little loosely. That sort of like a symmetry that Scott was drawing there. Like, what does it mean to say that you have an effect? Well, something has to affect something else, which then results in an effect. So there's an affect-effect relation. What would it mean, he's sort of asking, to have an effect if there wasn't anything that was affected, there wasn't anything to affect it, or there wasn't anything to be affected? So I think the question implicit in that sort of symmetry that he's drawing there, the affect-effect relation, as he put it, is actually a really good. I think that's the question in it is a really, really good question that shows sort of it relates to an objection I bring to the Kalam cosmological argument all the time, primarily the first premise, going a little bit more deeply, the idea that God creates time itself. When we think about causality, we're thinking about something that's procedural. We're thinking about processes occurring on things in some sort of order or procedure. I personally, I don't know how to disconnect any of that from the concept of causality. But if there was, I mean, we always hear ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing, nothing comes. And this is a principle that's often invoked specifically to argue that we need some, excuse me here, that we need some sort of efficient cause, at least, to then produce this effect. Because if out of nothing, nothing comes, then if there was nothing there at all, you would never have the effect. So they use the principle ex nihilo nihil fit to sort of invoke the principle of creatio ex nihilo. But if ex nihilo nihil fit is true, then creatio ex nihilo has to be false. Because if out of nothing, nothing comes, then even if you have an efficient cause, there's nothing for it to, as Scott is saying, to affect. So you still can't get an effect. So what does it mean to create time if creation itself is something that requires time? It's something that's procedural. And this is why the concept of creatio ex nihilo, I would argue, is just meaningless. It doesn't get you any further than having absolutely nothing at all, and neither a sufficient nor a necessary condition. Saying that, well, there might not be a necessary condition, but at least we have a sufficient condition, to me, that doesn't seem to make any sense. So Scott, I think, is bringing up a very, very good objection here, and bringing this sort of this effect relation that he's brought up.
Features of causality as we know it that to me seem essential, right? And you would disagree with that. You would say, well, no, those things are clearly not essential because we need a cause of the universe, and you can't have, you can't have time before time. You can't have space before space.
New chicken nuggets, everyday
What the
value.
fuck?
New chicken nuggets.
Oh yeah, sorry guys.
Value.
I don't. I'm a plebe. I don't have. Oh my God. We
And
seriously.
now for a
No, my
brief
God.
history
Shut up.
of
Shut up.
slavery.
Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up.
Here's
Shut up. Shut up.
And so on and so forth. So we clearly have
we
different
go.
intuitions about what aspects of our empirical experience of the world we have to get rid of, we have to sacrifice. That was the point I was making there.
Yes. Now, what I would say with respect to everything that has an efficient cause also has a material cause, that does have very powerful inductive evidence. There's no doubt about it. But the question is whether or not this is simply a common feature of our experience, or whether this is an essential feature of efficient causality, that it always acts on a material cause. And I think probably we could find counterexamples even within the realm of our experience as to when we do have efficient causes operating without material causes. And the most evident of these would be when the cause is an intellectual agent or mind who produces thoughts.
Wait, I'm confused though, because thoughts are like a lot of, and you see this with apologists, they still try to smuggle in this concept that thoughts are not like a material thing, that they're not materially caused. That's just not true. The evidence is in, and people who follow the field of neuroscience know that thoughts are physical. We know that thoughts are physical. That's not up for debate anymore. Given that this doesn't seem to be efficient causation with no material causation. I guess I understand that distinction between common feature and essential feature that Dr. Craig is making here, but if we're talking about something that we've never observed, an efficient cause producing an effect without acting or affecting, as Scott would put it, on a material cause, we've never observed that. That isn't something we can say we've ever seen. It's also something that doesn't seem, as I was talking about earlier, it really doesn't seem to make much sense. What would it mean to produce an effect if there wasn't a thing there to act on from which you produce the effect?
In that case, you have causality by a personal agent of mental events, but one doesn't need to have, or they don't have any sort of material cause. Thoughts are not constituted out of matter or stuff. And so that would provide a counterexample to the claim that efficient.
Just again, thoughts are constituted out of. Thoughts are the result of neurophysiological processes, electrochemical processes that occur in the brain. And it isn't just one of them, it's the collective operation of the brain that produces our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, our desires, in every facet of human cognitive function that we know and love and enjoy every day. And anybody who disagrees with that, I just invite you, examine the academic literature, both scientific and philosophical, and you'll find that the consensus on both sides is a physicalist perspective. Now, there might be disagreements within a physicalist framework, but you'll find on both sides, both the scientific and the philosophical sides, that physicalism seems to be certainly the consensus on the scientific side. From what I've seen, it seems to be the consensus on the philosophical side as well.
Causes are necessarily, rather than simply commonly, accompanied by material causes.
Yes, yes. So yeah, there's some ambiguity with respect to the phrase material cause, and the sense in which I understand it, which I think is the Aristotelian sense, is that the material cause, it's not a synonym for physical cause. So I want to be that seems like an equivocation to me, right? The material cause does not necessarily mean cause that is physical in nature, cause that is made out of matter and energy. As I understand it, the material cause of a thing is just the stuff out of which it was formed, physical or otherwise. And so I'm stipulating that that's what I mean when I say material cause.
Okay, well, that isn't the classic understanding. I mean, for Aristotle, prime matter was the material cause of which things are made. So it was a very physical notion. If you allow that thoughts.
So I think what Scott is saying is that, well, because technically Dr. Craig is correct here, and this is like, I think this would really be the only thing, and because I think I understand what it is ultimately Scott was trying to say. Again, I think, obviously I'm not in his head, I can't know for sure, so I wouldn't say that he's really incorrect here, but what he said didn't, I don't think, properly conveyed what he, or what, at least again, what I think he's trying to convey. So what he said is that, well, material cause doesn't really mean it has to be like physical matter or anything. When Dr. Craig is correct, that would be, at least generally, or I guess you could say normatively, what would be understood by the phrase material cause in Aristotelian causation. I think what Scott meant to say, and again, I can only speculate here, but this seems to be, especially with when he goes in further, what he was trying to say, that, well, it could be some sort of material that just isn't a part of our universe, but is still some sort of tangible substance. There's still a substance there. It's just not a part of our universe, which is very true, but that would still, in Aristotelian causation, that would still be considered a material. So that would still be considered some form of substance.
Have material causes. Well, then what's the problem with divine causation of the world? Because God is a personal agent who has thoughts and has will and intentionality, and he can will that the world exists. And as an omnipotent being, the world comes into being. So, I mean, if that's what you mean by a material cause, then that principle isn't sacrificed in having a transcendent cause of the universe.
So, one thing that I believe that you and I have in common is that we would both identify as nominalists.
I am also a nominalist as well.
And
Yeah.
as I understand the Kalam cosmological argument, what we're really talking about here is the beginning of existing of concreta, right? We're not talking about abstractions. We're not talking about events. We're not talking about mental events such as thoughts or concepts. So we're not talking about universals. We're not talking about numbers. We're talking about concrete objects, right? So when I say whatever, I'm really saying whatever concrete thing that has an efficient cause of its existence has a material cause of its existence, right? And so
what Scott is essentially saying here is that if you have some concrete physical thing, or I'll use some like concrete material thing, a concrete thing. If you have a concrete thing, even if there is an efficient cause for it, there has to be another concrete thing that it came from, or that was sort of transposed into it. And a lot of people have made the argument that's really what, when we talk about causality, that's what we see. We don't see things ever being caused out of their, like, not that they're always, it's a transposition of pre-existing material into a different form or shape or substance or something like that, or phase or state or what have you. And it seems that that's what Scott's saying, is that if you have a concrete thing, how would you bring it into existence out of nothing, even if you had an efficient cause? What is it that the efficient cause is affecting to produce this effect that is concrete?
The universe is not like a thought, right? The universe is a concrete object, and in our experience of the world, when
No, see, Danny, that's what Scott is saying here, is that the universe isn't an intentional state. It's a concrete thing. So how does God's merely intentional states, not being concrete, cause a concrete thing to be existing from no previous concrete thing? And I think that's a very good question. God's thoughts are, these are just intentional states, and those aren't concrete things. How did those cause a concrete thing? So I don't think Scott's confused here, unless you're seeing something I'm not.
we see concrete objects begin to exist, it's always by the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause, in our experience.
Yes. Well,
Uh-oh. I think I lost your audio.
Yeah, Dr. Craig, we lost your audio for just a second. So just repeat the
Okay.
last thing you said.
Oh yeah, you're good.
well,
now.
I was just going to comment that would at best show that this is a common feature of mundane causes, rather than that this is an essential feature of causality as such. It seems to me that if you have a personal agent who transcends, this is an
I'm sorry, I just need
essential
to hear that
feature
again.
of causality, mundane causes, rather than that this is an essential feature of causality as such. It seems to me that if you have a personal agent who transcends the world,
Okay,
that
wait,
that
hold on.
agent can, by
It's always by the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause, in our experience.
yes. Well,
Okay, yeah, this is where he cut
Uh-oh.
out.
I think I lost your audio.
Yeah, Dr. Craig, we lost your audio for just a second. So just repeat the
Okay.
last thing you said.
Oh yeah, you're good.
well,
now.
I was just going to comment that would at best show that this is a common feature of mundane causes, rather than that this is an essential feature of causality as such. It seems to me that if you have a personal agent who transcends the world, that agent can, by thinking, bring into
Okay, so I'm thinking Scott was talking about that we've never seen, like something material being caused from nothing, even by just an efficient cause. And it's Dr. Craig is responding, well, that just seems to be sort of a mundane feature of causality, not an essential feature. I would have asked, well, what is the argument for that? We haven't really ever seen any material cause be an effect in any way, shape, or form from nothing else that was previously material. That's never been something we've ever observed. But and the thing is, Dr. Craig utilizes appeals to intuitions often in his arguments. So why can't we appeal to our intuitions and say it's more probably true than not that these aren't just mundane features, that this is an essential feature?
reality concrete objects like the universe. Now, one of the difficulties with the argument, Scott, that you're propounding, it seems to me, would be that it leads to a sort of double absurdity. In the case of the universe, if the universe began to exist, then on the view you're suggesting, it would have neither an efficient cause nor a material cause. On my view, at least it has an efficient cause that explains why it comes into being, even though it doesn't have a material cause as you define the term. And so while I grant you that inductively our common experience shows that efficient causes work in cooperation with material causes, to deny that with respect to the beginning of the universe leads to a situation that far from being more plausible than my view, is doubly absurd because it says the universe came into being with neither an efficient nor a material cause.
So notice again, and I don't know if the timing being off from when he's speaking to when you can see him saying those same things is from me rewinding it, or if that was from him cutting out. But hopefully that doesn't prove a problem later on. But notice the language that Dr. Craig is using here again when speaking about time. He's sort of smuggling in an assumption. Do you know what that assumption is? And I will mention it later. I will definitely mention it later.
Yeah, I
I've already
appreciate that
mentioned it,
argument.
actually.
My view is that commits a kind of category error. It's viewing an acausal beginning through the lens of causality, right? So an analogy would be, hitting a home run without a ball is absurd, but hitting a home run without a bat or a ball is doubly absurd. Right, the universe being likewise, the universe being caused to exist without a material cause is absurd, but without an efficient and material cause is doubly absurd. The problem is that I'm not claiming to have hit a home run, and I'm not claiming that the universe was caused. So you would have it would be doubly absurd if you're positing that the universe was caused to exist without an efficient cause or a material cause. But I'm not positing that the universe was caused to exist in the first place, so I'm not claiming to have hit a home run either.
Yeah, I don't think that's a pertinent analogy. The home run here is the beginning of the universe, and you
No. I'm charitable here, so I don't think Dr. Craig I don't really think he's really misrepresenting. I think it's just the way he's framing it. But in Scott's mind, the home run is the universe was caused. And so it was caused without an efficient or a material cause, just like you hit a home run without a baseball or a baseball bat, let alone somebody to swing the bat. So yeah, that the home run that Scott was talking about is not that the universe began to exist, it's that there was a cause. But again, when William Lane Craig says the universe began to exist, what does he mean by that?
do
Think
believe
about that one.
the universe exists, existed in the past, and for the sake of argument, began to exist. So you've got the ball going over the fence on your view. Now, the question is there a causal explanation of that? And I would say that it's more plausible to say it's got an efficient cause that produces it than to say it has no cause at all, that it's completely acausal, which is what you're committed to.
So I disagree that the home run here is that the universe began to exist. If the home run here is that the universe began to exist, and we're saying it's absurd that it didn't have an efficient cause and doubly absurd that it didn't have a material cause, then you're begging the question in favor of the universe requiring a cause. But if you say that what the home run here is that the universe was caused to exist without an efficient cause or a material cause, then you get your double absurdity. But otherwise, you're just assuming the truth of the conclusion that the universe needed a cause, to my ear.
Well, but look at your argument. Your argument is that in the case of the universe, I'm positing an efficient cause without a material cause. And I'm suggesting that while that's unusual, you've not shown any sort of absurdity in it. You've just shown that that's not the way mundane causes work. But that leads to the absurdity that something came into being out of nothing. And that's contrary to the first.
Did you guys hear that? Something came into being out of nothing. That just, the language here is very, very, I guess you could say, assumptive. I don't want to use the term presuppositional, but yeah, there is a major presupposition here that Dr. Craig is working from naturally.
First argument that I give for the causal principle is that it's metaphysically impossible that being should come from non-being. And so there needs to be some sort of cause. In fact, Scott, if you look.
And see, that's interesting because what Scott is saying is that there wasn't an instance where there was no being and then being came, and then he's positing it must have just come from the non-being. He's saying that there's being, but it didn't come from anywhere at all. It just is there. Something probably like, I don't know if he'd claim it's necessary, but something probably like a brute contingency, or, you know, just a brute fact, something along those lines.
Look at the argument doesn't really specify what sort of cause the universe has.
Now, I do want to say that is technically true. Dr. Craig is correct there. You could really say, at least initially, obviously people can dig down into it once the argument had been presented, but at least initially you could say whatever begins to exist has either a material cause, an efficient cause, or both. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has either a material cause, an efficient cause, or both. So that initially, that the argument is essentially being presented that way. It doesn't presume initially what the type of cause is. You, as Dr. Craig mentioned earlier in the discussion, you would do a conceptual analysis to examine what kind of cause you would have, but you don't presume or presuppose some specific type of cause in the argument.
It just says whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has to have some kind of cause. And then we can investigate, well, what kind of cause was it? It was certainly efficient. Was it also material? Well, no, it can't be that, because all matter and energy came into being at the beginning of the universe. So,
but again, that's treating material cause like a physical cause, right? You could have had God creating the universe out of some non-physical material cause, some ectoplasm or some, you know, some previously existing stuff.
You'd better not admit that, or your argument goes by the board, because then that's what I could say.
Well, yeah, but you believe in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, so you wouldn't say that the universe has a material cause of its existence. I think that would be...
Theologically, I wouldn't say that, no.
Right.
But the point is that the argument itself doesn't tell you what kind of cause the universe has. It's only when you get to the conclusion and you analyze, well, what is it to be a cause of space and time, matter and energy, that you...
See, I think that ultimately this would, I don't know if Scott would word it this way, but that he would agree with at least the fundamental principle of that it seems almost absurd to talk about a cause of space and time and mass energy when the only place, the only things we've ever seen this causality thing that we observe ever act on is in the physical world, is in space time on mass energy. Never observed it any other way. And then that goes back to, thereby, I think one can certainly present an argument that they're being efficient, and or at least that they're, when we're talking about causality of materials, of concreta, there has to be some other concreta from which it comes. That you can't, that essentially that there can't be such a thing as creatio ex nihilo.
You get to the conclusion that this doesn't have a material cause in the typical sense. And so it forces you to adopt this very peculiar view that here we have a case of efficient causality without material causality. And all you're able to show against that is that that's unusual, but not that there's any kind of conceptual problem with that.
Right. So I think that there's parity here, right? So, you know, on your view, when it comes to you saying, you know, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, I don't know if things that begin to exist having causes is an essential feature of if having causes is an essential feature of things beginning to exist, or a common feature of things beginning to exist. Likewise, on my view, it's not clear that having a material cause is an essential feature of things being caused to exist, or an accidental or a common feature, as you put it. One thing that I always took note of in your defense of your argument is that you do, you know, your first premise is ambiguous with respect to whether that cause has to be efficient or material, and that runs afoul of my intuitions in a way to treat something beginning to exist as if it could have either, you know, it could have a material cause. As long if it doesn't have an efficient cause, it should at least have a material cause. But That's strange to me, right? Like if you and I went to a museum together and we were looking at a beautiful marble statue, and I turn to you and I say, Dr. Craig, what caused this statue to begin existing? And you say, marble. You know, I wouldn't feel like you had answered my question, because material causes are not really what we're thinking about when we say that such and such was caused to exist. And so it seems strange to me if you can have something.
Scott's exactly right here. And this is why, personally, I don't like to use notions of Aristotelian causation. I prefer to look at causality to differentiate between two, I guess you simplistically could say, two different types of causes. I would say conditions for causality. There's the, well, I don't know if I would even say that, because I don't think that strictly necessary conditions means that you still have some sort of causality. But I would say that there's necessary conditions and then there's sufficient conditions. And this is sort of a way of differentiating between material conditions and efficient conditions. So a necessary condition would be the conditions under which the actualization of the event can occur. And then the sufficient conditions would be those conditions that actualize the event. So to give an example, you have a cup sitting on a table, a cup of water sitting on a table, and a cat jumps onto the table and knocks the cup of water over. Well, and this is sort of like, I guess you could say, a parody of Scott's. The example he gave. If I asked you, well, what caused the cup of water to fall over, and you said gravity, that wouldn't really be telling me what the cause was, because we don't mean cause in that sense. It's not like technically wrong to say that, but it doesn't answer the question. So gravity in that scenario would be a necessary condition for the cup falling over. It's a condition under which that event can be actualized. It's sort of a condition that you need in order for this event to be actualized. But it isn't what actualizes the event. That's the cat jumping up onto the table. That is the sufficient condition. And that's how I choose to differentiate causality rather than using Aristotelian causality. That's just me, though.
Beginning to exist, if your argument allows for something to begin existing with a material cause without an efficient cause, to borrow some of your phrasing, it becomes inexplicable why things don't just begin to exist with material causes without efficient causes all the time, right? You would need an explanation for why that is.
Well, that's an interesting point. Whether something could have a material cause but not an efficient cause. But again,
I'd like to speak to that, actually. Again, I would let me get a drink of water here really quickly. I would make the differentiation. I would say, instead of material cause, I would say the necessary condition. And then instead of efficient cause, I would say the sufficient condition. But I do think that there can be, at least as Dr. Craig just worded it there, things that have material causes but no efficient causes. If you have a photon free streaming through the vacuum of space, it may decay into an electron-positron pair that will then annihilate back into a photon. There are necessary conditions under which that happens. You need the photon, you need the electromagnetic field, you need the electron field for the electrons and the positrons. So you could say that there's material causes there, but there is no efficient cause. There is no condition or set of conditions that actualize the photon decaying into the electron-positron pair. It most literally just happens stochastically. So there are there are things that happen that are I wouldn't really say caused, but that happen with only necessary conditions and no sufficient conditions. So in a sense, yes, I think that we do have definitive examples of things having material causes, as it were, without any efficient causes, as it were.
That's not germane to the case at hand, because in the case at hand, with the universe beginning to exist, there can't be a material cause in the normal sense of the word. And so the alternative, it seems to me, Scott, is you've either got to deny that the universe began to exist, or you've got to say that it came into being without a cause.
And I guess in some senses that could be a false dichotomy, but maybe not if you say, well, yeah, if somebody could grant, well, yeah, I think it doesn't have a cause, but I also don't think it came into being. So I guess it seems to me that Dr. Craig is saying here that if the universe came into being, then it either has a cause or it doesn't. But which I guess in a sense is true, but have we established that the universe came into being? Again, pay very close attention to the language that he uses.
And when I think of those alternatives, it seems to me more plausible to deny that the universe began to exist than to say the universe came into being without a cause. To me, that's just metaphysically absurd.
Yeah, it's because you and I have radically different intuitions about this, right? About what is essential to causality as we understand it. To me, to say that a causal event took place, you know, the creation of the universe, for example, we don't have to call it an event because that presupposes a sort of sequence, whatever you want to call it. But to say that something was caused in the absence of, you know, the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause. I mean, the idea here would be that an effect was produced without anything anywhere having been affected, right? And that
or anything, yeah, that's I think that what Scott said right there really really appeals to people's intuitions. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It really almost paints sort of this word might be a little bit strong, but the seeming incoherence of the concept of a cause with no concrete or an effect from no concrete thing that which could have been affected to produce or give rise to this effect. From what did the effect come? You can say, oh, well, the person, the efficient cause, but what did the efficient cause act on to produce the effect? If it didn't act on anything, not acting on anything at all is the same as acting on nothing, or and vice versa. So it seems that under Dr. Craig's view of just creatio ex nihilo, God acted on nothing. He did not act on anything at all, yet produced a concrete thing. But that doesn't make sense, because if he did not act on anything at all, then he did not act. And if he did not act, and creation is an act, how could he have created? And I know Dr. Craig would like to say, well, he did act. It was an act of will. But yes, what did he act upon? And if he didn't act upon anything, then how can we say that he acted and produced something? Because then you would be conceding that he didn't act on anything. Then he didn't act. How does he produce an effect?
That aspect of causality, as I understand it, intuitionally, it is indispensable, right? So to me, that is a higher, to borrow a phrase that you've used that I find incredibly useful, that is a
Oh my fucking God. This is insane.
higher intellectual price tag than just saying, listen, for all we know, the scope of the causal principle is simply physical and not metaphysical, because the universe is not the kind of thing that could have a cause as we understand causes.
All right. Well, I think we just have a real disagreement here on bedrock metaphysical principles.
Yeah, I agree.
Where would you like to go from here?
Yeah,
Matt, I didn't expect to get to a disagreement so quickly. Should we turn to the other? We could also talk about Scott. I don't know how developed your thoughts are on this, but the move that's made after the conclusion is reached. There's a cause of the universe, and we do this kind of conceptual analysis. I'm sure that you disagree with that. We could turn there if you'd like to stick here and talk about some other objections to premise one. How would you like to?
I would feel disingenuous taking on the argument about whether, if the universe has a cause, that cause is a person, an omnipotent, omniscient person, because what I can't get around is the idea of something like the universe having a cause, right? So I can't, I don't even think that much about that, because I'm still stuck. You know, if I'm like this, you know, if I were this perfectly neutral, you know, perfectly rational audience to the Kalam cosmological argument, I imagine somebody going, okay, but I still don't understand why we should think that something like the universe itself, you know, the totality of space and time, which, you know, by definition exists at all temporal points, by definition, you know, has literally always existed, needs a cause. And there's different ways to unpack that. You know, you can say that the universe exists necessarily. You can say it's a contingent proof fact. I understand that there's ways of looking at it in terms of A and B theory of time. But the one thing that you can't say is that the universe, you know, popped into existence or came from nothing. That language to my ear is misleading and paints a picture much like the one, you know, of the tiger popping into existence in my living room behind me right here, right? Where our intuitions about that are pretty solid, but I don't think that can be exported to something that has literally always existed.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think on a tensed theory of time, according to which temporal becoming is real, the universe doesn't just have a front edge, so to speak, which is its beginning, in the way that a yardstick, say, has a front edge at the initial inch. Rather, on a tense theory of time, that yardstick comes into being. And in that sense, it pops into being. Without a cause. That's what one means when one says from nothing. And that contradicts, I think, one of the most ancient and deeply rooted metaphysical principles of Western philosophy that goes all the way back to Parmenides, that being only comes from being, and that therefore something cannot come from nothing. And if to avoid the argument's conclusion, we've got to believe that something, in this case, the entire universe, just came into being for no reason at all, no explanation. That just seems to me to be unbelievable.
So there's two things here. I'm going to address the second one first, because it's going to be a little bit more quick. With what he just said, that there's got to be some sort of like explanation or reason or something. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Personally, I reject at least a strong principle of sufficient reason. So yeah, one could easily just say, yeah, I reject the principle of sufficient reason. The second thing, and I've been waiting for this moment to bring it up, is this entire time, if you guys haven't been picking up on me pointing it out and by listening, Dr. Craig, in the language that he's using, presupposes a tensed notion of time, whereas Scott is coming from more of a tense-less notion of time, where, as Dr. Craig described, the Big Bang, or the beginning of the universe, isn't the moment at which the universe physically arises or is actualized into a state of being from a previous state of non-being. It's just the front edge of this four-dimensional, tenselessly existing space-time block that's just there. And that's the way that Scott is looking at this. And so he's saying, well, the universe isn't caused at all. Causality doesn't apply here. It makes no sense. And Dr. Craig is coming from the perspective of the tense theory of time, or temporal becoming, which is, in my opinion, quite incoherent. What does it mean for something to come into time? How does something get into space-time? What does it mean to be outside of space-time to begin with? Just the temporal becoming is... it just appears to me as an incoherent concept. And that's what really differentiates A theory versus B theory, or tensed versus tenseless theory of time, is the notion of temporal becoming, where things actually come into a state of existence. They're actualized into existence in space and time, where they were previously not in space and time. And this is the one thing, because a lot of that language that Dr. Craig was using and sort of almost like shoehorning into the discussion of, well, being can't come from non-being. I don't understand how anybody could say that the universe just popped into being. All presupposes a tense theory of time. And the one thing I wish that Scott would have done is press Craig on on his view of time, though I did speak to him personally a couple weeks before he had this discussion. And he said he just doesn't feel philosophically equipped to handle the philosophy of time and the metaphysics of time discussion. And what I did want to say is that I used to be a pretty devout Craig follower. I've watched pretty much every debate that you can find on YouTube that he's been in. I've watched several of his defenders classes. I've read God knows how many articles and responses posted on the Reasonable Faith website. The one thing I've even looked in some of the previews that I've been able to find online of his books on the tensed and tenseless theory of time, he does not seem to speak or really want to speak about time in debates and discussions. And it's really interesting. He'll just mention, the difference between the tenseless and the tensed, and then refer people to his books. And I really, the other thing is that I don't, so that's interesting right off the bat. Why doesn't he do more? He just sort of presupposes a tense theory of time in all of his discussions, but never really wants to talk about that or why he presupposes it or the arguments for it. And I think that's a little interesting. But the other thing is that I don't see a lot of people press him on his really press him on his view of time. And this is one of the reasons why I would love to have a discussion with Dr. Craig, because I don't think that an A theory of time really fits with the full suite of data that we have, both empirically and I think it philosophically. It's got some issues as well, like I said, with the issue of temporal becoming, and also the issue of the present. What is the extent of the present moment? How do we define the present moment? And another thing that Dr. Craig grants is that, the concept of, relativity, to him, he's willing to grant that and still adheres to an A theory of time, which seems interesting, because if we grant that moments, what we say, so essentially what he says is that two different things can have a present moment at different times. But then that seems, under the tensed view, the A theory view, or rather more specifically presentism, which I believe is, I'm almost positive is the view that Craig takes to specifically, only things in the present moment exist. But if what we call the present can be relative, then existence is relative. And I'd wonder if Dr. Craig would be willing to concede that existence is relative, because I think that can lead to some interesting philosophical conclusions that I think most people probably wouldn't want to accept. So I really, really wish that somebody would really, obviously respectfully, but really press Dr. Craig on his view of time and how he substantiates it. I don't believe that he accepts Einsteinian relativity. I believe he is a neo-Lorentzian, because both special and general relativity explicitly show that time is tenseless. I mean, the empirical data for tenseless time is overwhelming. And this is why I don't think anybody can really defend the tensed view, the A theory, because quite frankly, albeit very important and meaningful in debates and discussions, philosophical argumentation simply does not trump well-established, consistently corroborated and verified empirical data. It just doesn't. And all that data points in one direction. Time is tenseless. Time is really just another dimension, much like length, width, or height. And that there isn't an objective present moment. The term present doesn't actually exist. There is no such thing as the present moment. And I think one of the best questions to ask a presentist like Dr. Craig would be, how do we define the extent of the present moment? Because if he's defining it as the extent of our temporal experience, I would agree with him. And I would simply say that the present moment is nothing but a feature of our abstract perceptive experience of time, but is not itself an objective feature of time. So if he were to say that, and I'm not saying that he would, I'm not even saying that he wouldn't have a good explanation, because he might, but if he would say, I do think that asking the question, what is the extent of the present, is a very good question to ask. And I think that if one answers, well, it would be the extent of our temporal experience, then that doesn't mean that you're defining an objective present moment, because somebody who adheres to a tensed view could grant that and say that's just merely a feature of our experience, our temporal experience. It isn't an objective property. So I really, really wish that I could see somebody challenge Craig on his view of time, because I really think that it needs to be done. As we've seen in this discussion, he's done nothing but presuppose a tensed view to appeal to people's intuitions, and sort of almost seemingly trying to draw an absurdity between the notion of the universe, not having a cause or causality not applying to it, by then asking, oh, well, it's just absurd. Are you really saying that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing? All of these sorts of questions that just appeal to your emotions to sort of make it seem like that concept is absurd, when if it's examined under a tenseless view, which I think is explicitly the view that seems to be implicated, that this is not absurd at all. So while I understand that Scott, he just does not feel that he is equipped to discuss with somebody like Dr. Craig, who is very well versed and has published a lot of work in the field of the metaphysics of time, he just doesn't feel he's well equipped enough to go toe to toe with him on that, and I can respect that. But like I said, I would love to see somebody, and it's something I really wish Dr. Sean Carroll would have done in his debate with Craig. I think that he kind of hinted at it a little bit, but didn't really take it all the way there. Of course, they didn't have an open dialogue, but I would have really liked to see him press Dr. Craig on tensed versus tenseless, and how, as Dr. Craig himself concedes, at least his version of the Kalam cosmological argument relies on a tensed notion of time.
So maybe
And I'm not alone on this. I wanted to quote for you a passage from David Hume, of all people, in a letter he wrote to John Stewart in 1754, in which Hume said this: "But allow me to tell you that I have never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. I only maintained that our certainty of the falsehood of that proposition proceeded neither from intuition nor demonstration, but from another source." In other words, what Hume was saying was that he couldn't prove the causal principle, that anything that begins to exist has a cause, but he regarded its denial as metaphysically absurd, and so he believed the principle. And I would be very happy to simply say that the causal principle is a metaphysical assumption of the Kalam cosmological argument, so that anyone who shares this assumption should follow the argument to where it leads, that there is a cause of the universe.
I don't think this assumption is a very well-founded assumption, though. Number one, I don't think Dr. Craig has really given a good demonstration of it being more of a metaphysical principle, rather than merely a physical principle, something that just exists within space-time on mass energy, other than seemingly appealing to our intuitions about, oh, well, it would be absurd to assert that the universe or that anything could pop into being uncaused out of nothing, when that again presupposes itself an A theory of time, which I think reasonably, very reasonably, can just be swiftly rejected. So those are just two issues that I have here. So that if we don't grant that that's a metaphysical principle, and if we don't grant the tense notion of time, the very concept of begins to exist goes out the window, as does the causality being a metaphysical principle. I also don't like it that Scott is doing the same thing, appealing to our intuitions and saying, well, it would be absurd to posit something that is concrete coming into existence from nothing that was concrete, even if it still has an efficient cause. And Dr. Craig just seems to just reject that. But it's strange that he can use appeals to intuition and appeals to absurdity of its denial to assert that this metaphysical, or that this causal principle he has is metaphysical, but that Scott can't do exactly the same thing to assert that his causal premise, that all all efficient causes must act on material causes. Essentially, that's wording it a little bit differently, but I still think it's a charitable summary of what it is. When he's not granting him the ability to use his appeals to intuitions to support that, and the fact that I would agree with Scott that it does seem kind of absurd to assert a concrete effect from merely an efficient cause with no material cause. So this seems like Dr. Craig is committing a double standard here, though I'm not willing to say that Dr. Craig is doing this purposefully. He may not realize that this is what he's doing, but it definitely comes off as that is what he's doing. Well, I can appeal to I can appeal to intuitions and to the absurdity of its denial to establish my causal principle as being metaphysical. But I don't think that you can do the same, and that just rubs me the wrong way.
Right. Well, if I understand the quote correctly, I'm certainly in agreement with Hume that it is an absurd proposition to think that anything could come into existence uncaused. I don't believe that. I don't think that objects within the physical universe could come to exist uncaused. And so I certainly don't believe anything could come into existence uncaused. Oh, you made another point right after that was really interesting, and I already forgot it. This is why I'm not a good note taker.
No.
Anyway.
But what you do think is that something can come into existence without a cause, namely a universe.
Well, okay, so let me ask, okay, here, so why is there an argument for why we should think that the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical and not merely physical?
That's a really good point, because it's not a physical principle. I think this is so important.
What? Maybe this is just me, but that just sounds circular to anybody else. Well, Scott's asking, well, how have we established that your causal principle is truly a metaphysical principle? Oh, well, because it's not a physical principle. What I'm sorry, but to my ears, that just sounds viciously circular. Viciously circular. Oh, it's a metaphysical principle because it's not a physical principle. Well, how do we know that it's not a physical principle when, quite frankly, the causal principle seems to be based off of our intuitions of the physical world and not on anything like that? That's where causality comes from. It is an intuitive thing we experience, and we only experience the physical world around us. Now, I know that there's many people, especially on Dr. Craig's side, that would disagree with that. But if we're speaking about the things that we can, in fact, verify, things that we know to be the case, things that go beyond mere speculation or spurious or rather dubious anecdotal evidence, we've only ever experienced the material and the physical world. Our intuitions about causality are built off that. So to say, and then to use the appeal to our intuitions about causality to argue that are based on it being our experience of the physical world, to argue that causality is metaphysical seems like a huge logical leap that I wonder if Dr. Craig even knows that he's making. But yeah, his response there seemed very, very circular.
It is a metaphysical principle, as I say, that underlies Western philosophy all the way back to the pre-Socratics. It's not like Boyle's law.
Yes, Brainbug, you are correct. That would be more of tautology. Oh, well, it's metaphysical because it's not physical, but you haven't established that it's metaphysical by establishing that it's not physical. Yeah, you are correct. Tautology is the better word to use there. Thank you.
Or the second law, or the conservation laws of thermodynamics, or laws of gravitation. It's not a physical law that simply governs our physical space-time arena.
And this is the thing. Scott's asking him how we know that when we've only ever observed it in the physical realm, acting on physical things. This is what Scott has been arguing this whole time. Like, causality is merely something we've intuitively experienced in our understanding and our experience of the physical world. We've never seen it beyond that. What arguments do we have, or what argument can be presented for why we should think that it is? And Dr. Craig just seems to be saying, well, because it is. This does seem quite both tautological and circular, that he's just tautologically asserting, well, it's metaphysical because it's not physical, and then just like not providing any defenses, just appealing back to the fact that it's metaphysical to argue that it's metaphysical.
But this is a metaphysical principle that being doesn't come from non-being, and that therefore nothing can come into existence.
And quite frankly, I would agree with Dr. Craig, with the principle that being doesn't come from non-being. But if I were going to play devil's advocate, I do think one could ask, well, what's the argument for that? If you have non-being, what would you have that would restrict being coming from it? Now, you could also say, well, what would the being come from, whether or not there was something to restrict it? And if it's non-being, if there's something they're restricting it, then it's not non-being. You wouldn't have non-being. But still, I would just be curious to see how Dr. Craig would answer the question, that particular question.
From nothing. There something comes into being only from something else. There needs to be a cause of something coming into being. So what folks like...
Also, I think it's interesting that Dr. Craig says being does not come from non-being, but yet thinks material can come from no material. Now, being and material are definitely not the same thing, but I do think one might be able to present an argument that there's some sort of connection between the principle that being comes from non-being, and if somebody wanted to make the principle that being cannot come from non-being to the principle that material cannot come from non-material. I think that in much the same way, I could say, yeah, material can't come from non-material. And it seems that almost like this is what Scott is doing, that he's utilizing the exact same reasoning, the appeal to our intuitions, which is not necessarily a wrong thing, and the seeming absurdity of accepting the negation of this, that material cannot come from non-material, to sort of show that if there is no material cause of the universe, which is certainly Dr. Craig would grant that, then there can't be an efficient one either. That the universe wouldn't have come at all because it's material.
Yourself have to do is to try to provide some reason for restricting the causal principle to this physical universe, or within the physical universe, I mean, but deny its applicability to the universe as such.
Well,
Right,
and
right.
now,
And I think there are...
now that was just blatant shifting the burden of proof. Scott asked him, how have we established that it's metaphysical? And Dr. Craig said, well, because it's not physical. And if it's not physical, then it's metaphysical. And if it's metaphysical, then it's metaphysical. You've got to show how it's just physical. He just begged the question and then shifted the burden of proof here. And again, I want to be, I almost think it would be more charitable to assume that he's doing it purposefully, because if I granted that he's not doing that purposefully, that he doesn't know, that he just begged the question and then shifted the burden of proof, that Dr. Craig isn't intelligent enough to realize that he just did that. Dr. William Lane Craig is an extraordinarily intelligent individual. I can't see how he can't notice what he just did there. It's hard for me to do that, guys. It really is. But I got to be honest, I don't want to accuse Dr. Craig of just being blatantly dishonest here, because what if he didn't realize that he just did what he did? Because that's what he just did there. He begged the question and then shifted the burden of proof back onto Scott. And if I were Scott, I would say that I'm sorry, Dr. Craig, but it seems like you just appealed to the fact that it's not physical, thereby it must be metaphysical, and then told me I have to explain how it's restricted to being just physical, when I asked you how we know that it isn't just physical and that we know that it is metaphysical. You should have an argument for that. And that's exactly what I do.
Or misunderstanding.
So I think that when somebody objects to the causal principle by saying, this is something that applies to,
I'd also be curious to know whether Scott maybe just didn't see him do that, or if he just doesn't really feel up to the task, I guess you could say, of calling Dr. Craig on it. Because I'm going to be honest, I can see how, with somebody as intellectually fortified, I guess you could say, as Dr. Craig is, and as intellectually skilled as Dr. Craig is, they might say, I think this is what you did here, but might not feel up to the task of calling them on it. Or maybe Scott just really, and I'm not saying anything bad about Scott here, like he's an idiot or anything. By no means am I saying that. But maybe he just didn't notice that's what Dr. Craig did there. But that definitely just happened. He begged the question and then shifted the burden of proof back onto Scott. When Scott asked him to show how we know that it's metaphysical, he just begged the question that it's metaphysical and said, "Oh, but now you've got to show how it's not metaphysical."
Things within the universe, the interaction of efficient and material causes within time and space. That what they're doing there is challenging the assumption that the scope of the causal principle is in fact metaphysical and not physical.
Right.
So to my ear, it does no
Right.
good to respond to that objection by reasserting the very thing being questioned, which is that the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical. That sounds question begging to me. So my question to you is, why should we think
hold on.
the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical? When somebody objects to the causal principle,
into being only from something else. There needs to
I want to
be
play this again.
a cause of something coming into being. So what folks like yourself have to do is to try to provide some reason for restricting the causal principle
That's
to
the
this physical
shifting right there.
universe, or
That was the
within
burden
the
shift.
physical universe, I mean, but deny its applicability to the universe as such.
right?
And that seems
And
to
I
me to
think
be a
there are.
fundamental misunderstanding.
So I think that when somebody
Also, I did just want to say, it may very well be the case that Dr. Craig is taking the causal principle as being metaphysical, as just sort of like a basic belief, like that's the null position, that it's metaphysical, and that somebody has to show how it's not. But I don't think that one can do that. I think that one would need to show that it is metaphysical. I don't think that could just sort of be. I don't think that could be presupposed reasonably. I don't think that's something that could fall under a presupposition. I don't think it would be reasonable to utilize that as a presupposition.
Objects to the causal principle by saying, this is something that applies to, things within the universe, the interaction of efficient and material causes within time and space. That what they're doing there is challenging the assumption that the scope of the causal principle is in fact metaphysical and not physical.
Right.
So to my ear, it does no
Right.
good to respond to that objection by reasserting the very thing being questioned, which is that the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical. That sounds question begging to me. So my question to you is, why should we think that the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical? After all, we've only experienced with things within the universe anyway.
So yes, Scott did catch his and I forgot about this because I remembered when I was watching this live, I noticed that, and then I noticed that Scott did catch the question begging. Now, Scott very respectfully pointed it out here because he didn't directly accuse Dr. Craig of being the question beggar. He just said, to my ear, when I hear somebody appeal to it being a metaphysical principle, when asked, how do we know it's a metaphysical principle based on our intuitions, our intuitive experience of it, seems to be question begging. So that it does seem that Scott did catch that Dr. Craig was begging the question there, and then politely pointed it out without being so accusative, I guess you could say. So that was really, really good.
Well, again, because it is stated as a metaphysical principle. It's not stated as a merely physical principle the way a law of nature is. So the person who wants to restrict the scope of the principle needs to provide some sort of justification, as I think you've tried to do with your argument about material causation. But I think that leaves us, as I say, with an absurd.
Yeah, see, here he's just pretty much saying, oh, well, I just grant that it's metaphysical as being the null position, and it's up to you to show how it's not. And I would say, I just reject that. I mean, do you have a demonstration? If not, I guess we're just going to have to move on, because I want to see a demonstration that it's metaphysical. I don't think that's been established, given all of our intuitions and experiences about causality are thoroughly founded in the physical world, and we've never observed them beyond that. So yeah, again, this just seems to be him claiming that, well, he just takes it to be sort of a presupposition, sort of axiomatic almost.
Situation. So the principle is simply, I mean, historically, it's been part of metaphysics. It's not part of science. presupposed, I suppose, by science, but the principle of it itself is part of, and always has been part of, metaphysics.
Well, you could rephrase what I'm saying here in a way that's amenable to that, right? You could say, you know, there's a lot of daylight between, you know, whatever begins to exist has a cause, and, you know, it being inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't just pop into being uncaused out of nothing, right?
Okay,
So
now wait, that's the second argument, though, that we haven't gotten to yet.
That's true. That's true. But the only reason I mention that is because I want to say that there are plenty of alternatives here, right? It could be the case that the causal principle, as stated, is false. It could be true that there's a different causal principle is true instead, but this causal principle is false. For example, Graham Oppie has a causal principle he offers that all non-initial things that begin to exist have a cause. It could be true that whatever begins to exist has a cause within time and space. You know, whatever begins to exist within time and space has a cause. There are many possibilities for why the causal principle could be false that don't commit us to thinking that there's just chaos. You know what I mean?
I think another really good argument, and I've kind of touched on this earlier in this review, that one could bring to show that the causal principle is false, is it's false in the sense that it isn't fundamental to reality. It isn't really a principle. It's essentially that causality is something much like temperature. It doesn't really exist at the most fundamental levels of reality, but it emerges out of the interactions of all of those fundamental aspects of reality. Much like temperature is a result of the collective energies between the interactions of the atoms and the electrons and what have you in some macro level material, causality is just the interactions between these macro level materials that doesn't really exist at the fundamental level of reality because things don't play out that way. And a good example of that would be like I mentioned earlier, of particle decay, a photon decaying into an electron-positron pair. There are no sufficient conditions for that. There's only necessary conditions in the sense that you got to have the photon, i.e. the electromagnetic field, and you've got to have the electrons and the positrons, i.e. the electron field. And then weak radioactive decay is another one. There's necessary conditions in that you need the atomic nucleus, and you need the W and Z bosons to carry the weak force that under which these happen. So you need the weak force, but there aren't any sufficient conditions determining when some unstable atomic nucleus is going to actually undergo a decay event. So these are events that, while albeit they have necessary conditions, we've already established that isn't what people are talking about when they want to know about the cause of something. Read the example with the cat jumping on the table and knocking the cup of water over. They're referring to the sufficient conditions, and there are no sufficient conditions here. Now, a lot of people, and I think I've even heard Dr. Craig make a similar argument, is that, well, there could be unidentified sufficient conditions. There could be sufficient conditions that we haven't found them yet. But we know that's not true because there are no local hidden variables in quantum mechanics, from the violation of not just Bell's inequalities, but the Leggett-Garg inequality as well. There are no local hidden variables that could be a sufficient condition. So this seems to show that at the fundamental level of reality, causality isn't a thing. It isn't a feature of reality at that level, which seems to show that the causal principle doesn't hold at all levels, and thereby isn't really a principle.
Well, now I would agree with both of the principles that you just stated, that all non-initial things have a cause, or everything that begins within space and time has a cause. But the point is that those more restricted versions of the principle don't justify a denial of the broader principle that being cannot come from non-being, that something cannot come from nothing. I just can't. Well, I mean, you say you believe that, I guess, and that if that's what you believe, fine.
See, again, he's interpreting Scott's position, with Scott coming from an explicitly tenseless view on this. He's interpreting it within the a-theoretical framework. So in a lot of ways, even though Scott hasn't stated that he's presenting this from a view of tenseless time, and maybe he's not. I guess I shouldn't speak for Scott, but just the way that he's talking about the universe and how it's disdain that sort of just exists there, and that it just kind of has this front edge. It doesn't require a cause. This is very much a tenseless view of the universe, that the universe is just a tenselessly existing four-dimensional space-time block with a boundary at one end of it, but this isn't a moment where its existence started. That is very, very much a tenseless view. And albeit Scott hasn't stated this, it still comes off me being able to infer that Scott at least seems to be arguing, again, I shouldn't really put words in his mouth, seems to be arguing from a tenseless perspective, that thereby Dr. Craig interpreting it from a tensed or an atheoretical perspective is subtly straw-manning Scott's position. And thereby it makes it look more absurd that he's denying this principle that being cannot come from non-being, when I don't think Scott would really deny that. He would just say that the universe isn't the kind of thing that comes from. So, and again, that's the problem. That's why I think when it comes to talking with Dr. Craig on specifically this argument, and again, I already explained, Scott didn't feel up to the task of discussing this particular topic with Dr. Craig, which is perfectly respectable. That I understand that completely. But for me, if I was going to have this discussion with Dr. Craig, us talking about time and the nature of time would probably be the very first thing we talk about, because that's going in. If I'm remembering correctly, I believe that Dr. Craig has stated that at least his version of the Kalam cosmological argument really hinges on it really hinges on the nature of time, on time being tensed. So, and Nestling, sorry, I'm probably not going to be able to answer your question because it is a rather nuanced question. And I don't want to come off as like rude or disrespectful or dismissive when I say this, but looking it up would probably, you would probably be able to find a much better answer than I could give, because for me, defining the difference between physics and metaphysics, it's very nuanced, and I don't really have the time in the middle of this review to explain the difference between them at the given instant. But yeah, it's just, Craig's entire argument really hinges, if I remember correctly by his own admission, on time being tensed. And so I think that's because the nature of time is what's going to set what really does, I think, set the framework for the discussion concerning the Kalam cosmological argument. It's when we want to talk about causality, it's going to differ if we're talking about it in a tensed or a tenseless sense. Begins to exist in a tense or a tenseless sense. Is there an earliest moment of the universe, a beginning? What that means is going to differ if we're speaking in a tensed or a tenseless sense. And so to me, the nature of time is a very fundamental aspect to this argument. And that's why that is the first thing I'm going to want to talk about if I'm talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, starting with the very first question: what do you mean by begins to exist?
But I could never, I'm more like David Hume, I could never believe what to me seems so absurd is that things could come into being without being caused. Let me ask you no, never mind. Okay, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh no!
Well, now I want to know the question.
Oh yeah, me too.
All right. I was going to ask Scott. I mean, for me, this is a very personal issue, right? This is serious business. It's not just looking for an academic refutation of a proof. We're trying to get at reality and figure out the nature and meaning of the world. And so I wonder, would I be willing to stand before God on the judgment day and God were to say to me, why didn't you believe in me? And I would say, well, because I thought the universe might have popped into being uncaused out of nothing. I think God would look at me and say, you what? I'm just not prepared to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, this isn't, and I'm sure Dr. Craig is kind of, just being a little bit hyperbolic, being a little joking here, but that aside, this isn't an argument for anything. Like, is this supposed, I don't know what this isn't even an appeal to. like just you're saying, oh, well, I just couldn't stand before God and say, well, I didn't believe in you because I didn't think the universe had a cause. I think it popped into existence out of nothing. Scott Clifton has already conceded he doesn't think the universe popped into existence out of nothing. And Dr. Craig seems to keep almost pigeonholing him into that position that he thinks the universe just popped into being uncaused out of literally nothing, that being can just come from non-being, when he's made clear that isn't actually what he thinks. And Dr. Craig is then using that, pigeonholing him into this position to say, oh, well, that's just absurd. I don't see how anybody could really, truly believe that. But I mean, if that's what you say you believe, when the difference, again, and I have to harp on that because if we haven't figured out already, as you could see from me hinting at the way that Dr. Craig was wording things, all of this hinges on the nature of time. Dr. Craig is going to interpret this argument and even the objections to it within a tensed framework when it comes to time. And that's why I argue, personally, it is crucial to get at what the nature of time is first before we dig into this argument any further. And what we end up finding is when we get into the nature of time and we establish that time really is tenseless, the rest of the argument crumbles quite easily.
Are you?
Right, but I reject that imagery, right? I don't think that's what by denying the causal principle, I don't think that's what is entailed by it. That seems wrong to me, right? That the idea that there was this, and perhaps you could unpack this, right? Because I don't really understand the reasoning behind this,
and that's the thing, is that what Scott really means to say here is that I reject looking at causality in the beginning of the universe in this tense notion that the beginning of the universe was more an event that happened rather than just a boundary to space-time, rather than just this boundary. It's an event. It's a thing that happened that requires some cause. And he's not saying that, well, it just doesn't have one and just popped into existence out of nothing. That he's saying it isn't a thing that requires a cause. It isn't an event that happened. And that would be very much what somebody who would take a tenseless view would say. I think Scott has said, and don't quote me on this because I could be wrong. Again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I thought I remembered him saying that he does tend toward a tenseless view, but he just, he doesn't think he's versed enough in, the philosophy of time to really defend it, which again, is perfectly respectable. But yes, to me, and when he asked maybe Dr. Craig does have an argument for this. Well, Dr. Craig would say, well, it's because I look at time in a tensed view. So the beginning of the universe isn't just some boundary, but it is an event that happened and thus requires a cause.
I admit that, that I don't see how the universe did any coming from. If there's no such thing as anything earlier than the universe, and we also agree that there's nothingness is not like an actual circumstance that could obtain. Right. It's not an actual state of affairs. So whence cometh the universe, right? I mean, it seems to me that as long as you stipulate those two things, that there's no such thing as before the universe and there's no such thing as nothing, then what do you mean when you say that the universe came from nothing? There's no nothing to come from.
I've answered that. When I say from nothing, you mean not from anything.
Right.
That's
but I agree with that.
Right. It came not from anything. And
what Scott is saying is that that's his entire argument. The universe did not come from anything. The causal principle just doesn't apply here. It's not that it came and it was just, there was like literal nothingness and boom, a universe. Scott has already said that that's not what he's saying. What he means is that there just isn't. The universe was just there. There was never a come from. Come from doesn't apply to the universe. It applies to things in it, but not to it. And that Dr. Craig, in his view, hasn't really given a good argument for why we should think it applies to the universe. Just that, well, it does, and you have to show how it doesn't, which is just not just not the right way to go about that. Again, it was begging the question and then shifting the burden of proof.
I think that, well, the question is that metaphysically absurd to think that the universe came into being not from anything?
No, I don't think it's metaphysically absurd at all. And this is the thing, is that the universe existing, the way I word it, which is what I believe, is that the universe exists simpliciter. It just exists. Simple as that. without any further qualification or condition. The universe, and I say this a lot, I quote this a lot, but as Carl Sagan once famously said, the universe just is, and that's all. And I think that it seems at least that Scott is sort of coming from the same perspective. There's nothing, while it might violate certain intuitions that we have, sure, there's nothing unreasonable or illogical about that position. There just isn't. One can disagree with it. It's reasonable to hold this position. I think it's also reasonable to disagree with it. And it seems that this is what Scott is saying, and that thereby the universe is just this, like I said, this tenselessly existing four-dimensional space-time block. It just exists implicit or with a boundary at one end. It didn't come from anything at all. And that's not to say that there was a nothing and it came out of it as an event that happened. It's saying that there was no event, there wasn't a come from. It makes no sense to speak of the universe in this manner. And the thing is, the overwhelming majority of cosmologists would say exactly the same thing.
Well, but even came into being, like, I would phrase it differently, right? I would just say the universe didn't come from anything. Not that the universe came from not anything. I would say the universe didn't come. It didn't do any coming. There was nothing.
Well, exactly. Scott doesn't want it to be painted as this image of there being this state of nothingness, and then the universe just comes out of it, or that the universe comes from anything. And that's the thing. There is no come from. That doesn't happen here. It makes no sense. It's like asking, what's north of the North Pole? What if I go 2 inches of the north of the North Pole? Where am I at? It makes no sense to even ask the question. And that's what Scott is getting at here. And again, I don't know if this is just going over Dr. Craig's head. I don't think it is. I think he's just choosing to respond to it from a tensed perspective. And from his perspective of time, what he sees Scott saying is that there's just like and I know it gets hairy talking about a literal nothingness because we're limited by our language, so please bear with me, guys, that there was sort of a state of literal nothingness. Yes, I know that makes no sense. And then the universe most literally just, this event just happened, and the universe became an extant thing with no rhyme, reason, qualification, condition, justification, explanation, or cause. And that is not what Scott is saying.
Well,
Coming is like a verb, you know what I mean? It creates
right.
an imagery
It's
that doesn't seem right.
It's a tensed verb. And the beginning of the universe, I think, is a tensed fact. Remember my analogy of the...
Exactly. And this would just be the perfect moment to say, I reject that. I don't think we have good evidence to show that time is tensed.
Yardstick. It's not
Right.
just that the
Yeah.
yardstick has a first inch, but that the yardstick came into being in the sense that it began to exist. So the verbal tense is important here on a tense.
Well, I mean, Scott could just say, well, the way that you're presenting it there, where it's just sort of like a yardstick, where it's distinct, that just the whole thing just exists, and it's got sort of an edge at one end of it, a boundary at one end of it. If I were Scott, I would say, well, that's just how I'm looking at it. That boundary isn't a cause, it isn't an event, it's a boundary. It wasn't a point at which things could have happened to the universe. It just that makes no sense.
Theory of time, which I've gone to great efforts to defend.
Not very well, I must admit.
Yes, and I concede that that's not something I'm prepared to disagree with you about. You are the world's probably foremost expert on the difference between A and B theory of time and the arguments between them. All I can say is that intuitively, B theory seems more right to me.
Okay, well, that's
but I also don't. I don't want to, and I don't believe I am hinging my objection to the Kalam cosmological argument, or the causal premise in this case, on B theory. I wouldn't want to make that mistake.
Well, so
I agree. I don't think Scott's argument has to have a tenseless time, but I would say that his argument, and I fully agree with his argument. I think Scott is just absolutely nailing it on the head right now. in terms of, the causal premise and this causal principle, and how, why it applies within the universe but not to it, and do it, just almost taking Dr. Craig's argument and style of argumentation and developing something that seems to thereby an argument, utilizing exactly that to support an argument that seems to itself disagree with or contend with Dr. Craig's argument. And I think he's doing a beautiful job. I think that he's presenting a cogent argument here. But what was I going to say about but yeah, I think that the argument that he is presenting certainly implies a tenseless notion of time, though I don't think it necessitates it.
So far in our discussion today, if I were to summarize your position, it seems to me that your misgivings are that necessarily every efficient cause is accompanied by a material cause. And since that isn't the case at the beginning of the universe.
True. I think a better way to word that would be every efficient cause acts on a material cause to produce the effect.
Therefore, the universe began to exist without a cause, and you're willing to simply bite the bullet and affirm that metaphysical fact.
Right. And again, this goes back to your heuristic about intellectual price tags, right? Because
right, that's right.
To my ear, the high, what accepting the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument commits us to is a lot. We have to accept that there are unembodied minds, that there are timeless persons. We have to accept that an effect can be produced without anything having been affected anywhere at all. We have to accept, we have to sacrifice a lot of features of causality as we understand it. So if all these things are true, I want
to disagree with that. You don't have to sacrifice a lot of features of causality. You would just say that some.
So just for Richard, I don't really know what you mean. I said that I agreed with Scott that his argument doesn't commit you to a tenseless theory of time, though I said that I think it certainly implies a tenseless theory of time. But implying doesn't mean it's necessitating or committing you to it. And yes, I did watch this when it was live like 2 weeks ago. So obviously I watched it, but that doesn't mean I remember every point that was made. Like even in this review, there's been numerous points that I like when Scott did actually, in fact, call Dr. Craig out on his begging the question in regards to supporting the claim that the causal principle is metaphysical. I had completely forgot that he had done that. So you seem to be like trying to paint me as doing a dishonest review, as if I went and watched this ahead of time and them acting like I'm, big brained anticipating what their responses are going to be, and then saying, "Aha, see, I got it right." No, I had said that I watched this before. I'm reviewing it. I'm giving my opinions on some of the arguments that were made and things like that. That's what these debate reviews are about. That's how they work.
Some common features of causality.
Yeah, he said saying that his argument commits you to a tenseless theory of time would be a mistake. It would be a mistake for him to say his argument requires or commits you to a tenseless notion of time. And I said, yes, that's true. I agree with that. But I said that it implies a tenseless theory of time, but does not commit you to one. So I'm agreeing with what Scott said.
Causality are not necessarily essential to causality, but those other elements you mentioned are quite right. That's right. I think for our listeners, they have to assess where does the higher price tag lie.
Right. And so, conversely,
I do want to answer that question quickly, because the thing is, I think that when one examines, especially the physics on this, I definitely think the intellectual price tag is a lot higher in accepting a tense notion of time. I mean, even if you read like the articles on time from like the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you'll see just the A theory of time, tense notions of time, don't really seem to pan out very well. Primarily just in light of all of the evidence from physics that we have, but also because there are some philosophical issues. And like I said, just to reiterate, the one that I brought up earlier is, well, how do we define the extent of the present moment? So I would say, to answer Dr. Craig's question there, that taking a tensed view of time definitely has a higher intellectual price tag. I think one has an uphill battle trying to defend that such a temporal notion. I really do.
I think the only bullet that I'm really biting is that things beginning to exist having causes is a common feature, an extremely common feature, but it can't possibly apply to everything, right? It couldn't apply to the universe itself for some of the reasons that I've given. That, to me, that doesn't seem like a huge bullet to bite, especially given, you know, how ill-equipped we are in terms of our intuitions about how the world really works.
Well, I think that the big bullet that you bite, Scott, is that as a result of your argument, you're stuck with the universe coming into existence without explanation, for no reason at all, without a cause. It's the
Except he said that he doesn't think the universe came into existence. Scott has explicitly said that he just doesn't think that's the right terminology to use, that's not the right way to look at it, that it just didn't come from anything. There was no coming. And I mean, at this point, I think personally that Scott has been pretty forthcoming with that. I think he's explicated that a little bit further, especially like 5-10 minutes ago. So for Dr. Craig to say what he's saying now, at least Dr. Craig could like preface or follow it up at least with, now what I just said would be true under a tensed view, that you would have to presume that the universe physically comes into existence with no cause or no reason or no explanation. It just comes into being uncaused out of nothing. But if you do grant a tenseless view, it would be more that it just doesn't come from anything at all. And I'm not going to say that I think it's dishonest of Craig not to add that caveat. I do think Craig knows the caveat is there. I don't know if I would say that it's really dishonesty. I think it's a little weaselly, maybe, that you're speaking from this tensed view as if it's the view, the standard. I mean, he could at least grant the caveat that, well, if you grant the view that I do, which is tensed view, then you would have to be saying this. But I understand that if you take the tenseless view, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. I do think that would just be a more honest way of wording what Dr. Craig is wording.
The view that my friend Quentin Smith used to say, the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Sort of a nice Gettysburg Address of atheism. Well, yeah, that does seem to me the bullet you're going to bite, given your principle that every efficient cause must have a material cause as an accompaniment. And I would rather let that go by the board than give up the idea that the universe beginning had to have some sort of explanation.
Yeah, it seems to me sometimes it's, oh, sorry. Yeah.
We've only got about 10 minutes left, and I was thinking that it might be fun to turn to the second argument that Dr. Craig normally gives.
I would like to do
that for about 10 minutes.
It is a follow-up argument, Scott, to the first one we've been talking about. Suppose you're willing with Scott to bite the bullet and say things can come into being without a cause, or things can begin to exist without a cause, to put it more neutrally. Then, as Arthur Pryor pointed out, you face this very difficult question. Why is it only universes that come into being without causes? Why can't Beethoven or bicycles or root beer or anything just come into being or begin to exist without a cause. Once you allow an exception to the principle that everything that begins to exist has a cause, then there's no answer, it seems to me, to that question. And yet, obviously, things aren't popping into being uncaused all the time around us.
And again, Dr. Craig speaking from a tense notion of time versus a tenseless, where, and I mean, it's like Scott has already said that he leans into more of a B theory notion than an A theory notion. And it's, I mean, at this point, it's almost disconcerting that Dr. Craig hasn't been willing to acknowledge that and continues to speak about these things from the tensed perspective as if that is the, like, almost as if there's not a debate, and that is the standard position, which straightforwardly, that's false. You would be hard pressed to find anybody in physics that would accept the tensed notion of time. And I'm fairly certain that the majority of physicists, or rather philosophers, especially those more relevant to this, philosophers of science, philosophers of physics, philosophers of time, I think, I don't know if I'd say overwhelmingly, but I know that the majority of them do take a tenseless notion, just because the physics is pretty, I mean, the physics is pretty square on this in terms of whether time truly is tensed or tenseless. But by the way, Rodneckiness, I wouldn't say virtual particles pop at all. I would say that vacuum fields fluctuate, which doesn't mean what most people mean in their minds, but that's not what I will be making a video probably on quantum fluctuations at some point.
Yeah. I have two thoughts about that. One is that
Okay.
it seems to me that we can make a kind of parody argument on the other side of that. Like your defense of the Kalam cosmological argument entails that it's not impossible for events to occur uncaused, right? And so now, to me, that really runs afoul of my intuitions, right? That events can just happen spontaneously.
You can
Oh my
always count
Lord.
on your Touchstone Energy.
Like I said, guys, I'm
Cooperative to
sorry, I'm a
power
plebe.
every
I don't
moment
have
of your
YouTube
day.
Premium. I'd say if you don't want this to
So I
happen, donate
would
to my
ask the same
Patreon.
kind of
But
question.
I don't
would
have a
say,
Patreon
well, if it's
either.
possible
So.
for one event to occur uncaused, it becomes inexplicable why anything and anything doesn't just occur. Like, why isn't my pen just floating up in the air and spontaneously combusting? Why aren't windows breaking uncaused all the time?
Now, let me interrupt at this point, Scott, and say that while the causal premise is formulated in terms of substances rather than events, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, it doesn't deny that every event has a cause. It just says I'm not committed to that. The argument doesn't commit me to that. If I were to deny that every event has a cause, it would probably be for reasons of libertarian freedom, namely that I'm not a determinist. And so I think that personal agents, can freely bring about causes without being determined to do so. But that's a quite different debate with respect to libertarian freedom. The Kalam argument is just neutral as to whether every event has a cause. So there's no parity available there.
Well, right, but the lesson, as I take it here, is that, well, here you have an example of something, in this case, events. If you allow for mental events, right, and yet clearly you agree that just because mental events, like in the context of libertarian free will, can occur without a cause, it's not inexplicable why other events, like my pen floating in the air, can happen without a cause, right? So clearly it doesn't follow that just if it's the case that the universe is uncaused, then we would expect to see objects within the universe popping into existence uncaused all the time.
Well, now, libertarians would typically affirm agent causation with respect to acts of free will. It's not as though acts of free will just...
The problem with libertarian free will is it essentially means that people have causalist thoughts, or at least causalist decisions, that the decisions that we make there are no antecedent factors that give rise to those. I suppose somebody might say, well, I mean, you're experiential knowledge might inform decisions that you make. But then I would say then that can't be truly libertarian free will, because part of the decision that you make is going to be based on your knowledge, given your given knowledge at that time, helping you to figure out what decision it is that you're going to make. And that seems to be more of a compatibilist view, which is what I would take. But there was something I did want to mention, because I've heard this objection from, and when I was on Discord, when I had mentioned that, well, causality isn't really a fundamental principle or notion in reality because of, various events that happen properly causally at the quantum level. And I was asked, well, if these events can happen causally at the quantum level, why can't they at the classical level? And I said, well, because the mathematics is different. I mean, the way that classical level objects simply behave is actually drastically different than they do at the quantum level. And it's much like asking, well, if temperature exists at the classical level, why doesn't it exist at the quantum level? Because these are two different levels of reality. These are two different scales. Things emerge out of the quantum level of reality that might not be present in it, like temperature, like causality.
Happen.
So I guess in short, they're emergent properties. That's why. That's why they don't exist at one level of reality, but then they do at another. They have emerged out of those more fundamental properties and interactions.
Randomly, there is an agent there who can freely choose to do this or that. But in the case of the universe beginning to exist, see, there's nothing prior to it. On atheism, there's nothing there. So if that can happen without a cause, anything should be able to happen without a cause, because there's nothing to restrict it.
Yeah. See, I think of it the opposite way, right? I think, okay, if there were time before.
Yes, Nestle, time is a property at the quantum level that is complementary with energy. Also, time is so the laws of physics, I mean, even classically, but certainly at the quantum level, the laws of physics are reversible. So you could like take systems and run them backwards in the laws of in time, and laws of physics are largely going to operate the same way. The only ones that don't are the laws of thermodynamics. And this is why we believe that thermodynamics, especially the second law, has a lot to do with what's called the thermodynamic arrow of time. Also, antimatter doesn't actually literally move backward in time. We just depict it that way because it's antimatter. It's just the particular convention we've chosen to associate with antimatter to distinguish it from matter, but it doesn't actually physically move backward in time.
For the universe, you've got like nothing happening, and then pop, universe. That I would completely deny that that's possible, right? But we're not talking about a circumstance like that. We're just talking about the universe just being there at all temporal points, right? And again, I know that goes into A theory and B theory, and I'm not prepared.
Yeah, it does, because the Kalam argument is not committed as such to saying that time began at the creation of the first event. People like Alan Paget and Richard Swinburne, John Lucas, and others have discussed the idea that there could be a kind of non-metric time prior to the moment of creation. So I try to open alternatives.
I mean, that's true, but a lot of that stuff, honestly, like a lot of notions of like non-metric time, imaginary time, things like that, I don't think they would really serve a theologian very well here. A physicist, perhaps, but I would struggle. I guess I would struggle to see how notions of some other form of a different type of time prior to the time that exists in our universe lends any more credence to these theological arguments from the beginning of the universe. In fact, it seems then what happens is that we can in fact extend the universe backward even further and potentially find a cause of the universe. I don't see how notions of other forms of time serves the theologian well here.
To people rather than close them off. And I'm open to the idea that there was time prior to the creation of the physical universe. I don't think there was, but I'm not prepared to say that that's impossible. Well, and in that case, you need to ask yourself, how do you, I mean, if you think that, suppose you think there was time prior to the beginning of the universe,
Yeah, then I would
then
certainly agree
in
with
that
you
case,
that
you
the
ought to
universe.
say that the universe began, the universe had a cause.
Yeah, yeah.
So Scott, I mean, wait a minute now. Look what you've just done. I mean,
Why would that commit him to having to say that it's a cause? Because we, like I said earlier, towards the beginning of this review, we already know that the earliest moments of the universe are quantum mechanical, and we already know that causality is not a thing. It has no ontology at the quantum level. So yeah, he could grant that there's a time prior to the time of our universe, some sort of non-metric time, but that doesn't commit him to admitting that there's a cause. Now, there might be a necessary condition to the production of our universe, but he's not committed to there being a sufficient condition, which again is what we really mean when we talk about causes.
I think you've backed yourself into theism here, because on the view that time precedes the beginning of the universe, you admit that the beginning of the universe would require a transcendent cause. And that's exactly what people like Richard Swinburne, John Lucas, Alan Paget, and others believe. So I think that you should become a theist.
Yeah, no, it's true. I don't find that objectionable, but I think we don't have time to go into it, but I think there are implications of that are obviously problematic. Well, one question I wanted to ask you for clarification is, when you make this argument that it becomes inexplicable, are you making a would kind of argument or a could kind of argument? Are you saying that if the universe is uncaused, then we would see things popping into being within the universe, or that it's possible?
Well, I think I'm saying would, that if the universe can come into being, begin to exist without any cause at all, then it's inexplicable why anything and everything wouldn't pop into being without a cause. Because there's nothing to constrain it. You see, there's nothing to constrain coming into being, because there is no universe prior to the universe to make it the case that only universes can pop into being uncaused out of nothing.
Well, okay, so
what if there was, though? I mean, we're just talking about there potentially being time before time, but now we can't talk about there being something before the universe, constraining it such that if we grant that this begins to exist notion, it only applies, or begins to exist without a cause, that it only applies to the universe? What? That seems to be just like an assumption that Dr. Craig is just running with here. What? I'm going to need to see the argument that. I think that somebody could argue that there's some sort of there's something that existed sans the universe that constrained only it being capable of just sort of coming into existence without a cause. I mean, not that I would believe that anyway, but the statement that there isn't anything there to constrain it, how do we know that? What if there was?
I do want to say, to say that something is inexplicable, I mean, that you're not just saying, you're not just asking me what's the explanation. You're making a very ambitious claim here, which is that an explanation is impossible. I think that shifts the burden back onto you to show that such an explanation is literally impossible. Now, here's an analogy, right? Say I push the button.
Okay, I thought I did that. By my argument that there is nothing prior to the existence of the thing to constrain what sort of thing can come into being without a cause.
Yes. So let me answer that. Yes. So,
okay.
So suppose I push a button for an elevator and the elevator door is open and I see that the elevator is at maximum capacity. There's 15 people in there and I can't fit. I can't get on the elevator. Now, let's say the elevator is analogous to the universe, right? The explanation of why I'm not getting onto the elevator is about facts in the elevator, right? It's facts that have to do with what's already in the elevator, not facts about what's outside the elevator. It's not a perfect analogy, but outside the elevator would be the nothingness. So that this argument that nothingness it's not discriminatory, it has no potential. I don't think it's the nothingness part, it's the nothingness side that's stopping something from coming into being. It's the something that's stopping something from coming into being.
The problem is, Scott, you've got to have something that it's explanatorily prior to the packed elevator. You can't use the packed elevator to explain it because that's already there. You need something that is explanatorily prior to the thing that begins to exist. And there isn't any such thing on an atheistic view.
Yeah, this just presupposes the principle of sufficient reason. One could easily just reject the principle of sufficient reason, and there's actually a large body of philosophers out there that do reject the principle of sufficient reason.
Well, that's just a different question, though. We can ask the question, why are there all these
No.
people? Why is there an elevator, and why are there so many people in the elevator? But the question that you were asking, well, the claim that you were making is that it's impossible to explain why things don't pop into being uncaused all the time within the universe. And I'm saying it's hardly impossible to explain that. Here are all these alternatives. It could be that the causal principle as phrased is false and some other causal principle is true instead. It could be the Graham-Oppy's causal principle.
No, wait,
that.
that wouldn't work. That's the genius of this second argument. The second argument is willing to allow you that things can pop into being uncaused out of nothing. But it demands, if that is possible, then why doesn't just anything and everything pop into being uncaused? That's Arthur Pryor's argument. And I think it's such a powerful second step because, as I say, it allows you to say things can come into being uncaused out of nothing, but then it asks why that isn't the case for everything. And the reason an explanation is impossible is because there isn't anything explanatorily prior to those things that would restrict what can come into being uncaused.
I hate to do this. We are at the hour mark, and that is the time that we could give to Dr. Craig. I appreciate both of you guys for coming on. Dr. Craig, is there anything that you'd like to say as we sort of
Yes, I would
out?
like to say that it is wonderful to chat with someone who has thought so seriously and thoroughly about these considerations. I lie awake at night thinking about these things, and I'll bet Scott does too. So thank you, Scott, for this engaging discussion today.
I can't tell you how much that means to me. I have so enjoyed this conversation. And again, I thank you for your time and your generosity and your charity. And this has been great.
I've really enjoyed this has been me the whole time. Just sitting back, listening to the conversation.
You're a great interviewer, Cameron.
That's what you got to do, right? A lot of these guys want to jump in too much. Well, yeah, thank you guys both for coming on. It's been super, super awesome. Again, I was just sitting back listening to the dialogue. I loved it. It was great. But until the next video, I will see you guys later. Thanks again for joining me, and see you later.
All right.
Okay, so yeah, that was that discussion. I did think it was a good discussion. But I think that either the point that Scott was making went over Dr. Craig's head, or he just didn't really want to acknowledge the point from within the framework that it's being presented, opting instead to interpret it from his preferred framework and then argue that makes it absurd. And to me, like I said, that's the biggest thing for me, is that all of Dr. Craig's objections rested on the notion of a tense theory of time. And it seemed that the position that Scott was making doesn't necessitate or commit you to a tenseless view, but seems to certainly imply one. And it seemed that he had at one point stated that he does lean in that direction, although that he didn't feel he was capable of engaging Dr. Craig in a discussion about that. And that's the thing. Like I said earlier, that's the very first place I would start. And if I do have discussions about the Kalam cosmological argument, I try to start with time, because that is going to, in some ways, constrain the nature of the discussion beyond that. That would, no, this is probably not going to be opened up. Starting with that, because everything about the Kalam cosmological argument definitely, I mean, it hinges on the nature of time. The nature of time is a very, very important aspect to understanding what the argument is trying to even say. Because if somebody says begins to exist, somebody that hears that, like me, who looks at time from a tenseless perspective, is going to think, well, begins to exist. What does that mean precisely? Versus somebody who adheres to the tense theory of time, here's begins to exist. They're going to have completely different thoughts about what that means. And that's why I think that when it comes to discussing the Kalam, it should come down to the first thing that needs to be discussed, in my opinion, is the nature of time and what time is. So I hope you guys enjoyed this this live review of this debate. Again, I really enjoyed that debate, and I did actually enjoy discussing it. I really think that Scott pointed out, I'm not going to say he pointed out flaws in the Kalam, but just showed that maybe the conclusions that are reached by the theologians are a little bit hasty. Maybe there's some other things we should sit down and have a stronger, longer discussion about. I think that the way that he parodied Dr. Craig's argument really showed that, maybe this argument is a little bit misplaced, not necessarily like invalid, but just misplaced. There's definitely still a conversation to be had on it. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. And remember, through reason, we progress.